great to be with you again. Now that the Ninth Circuit, in its wisdom, has ruled on the Trump executive order, I thought it would be interesting to actually talk about what that means. Because it isn't at heart about immigration. It isn't even at heart about a legal decision. Although listening to these guys torture the plain meaning of language, you do understand that there is now no end to the Orwellian rabbit holes of legalisms into which a great nation can disappear. It's only a matter of time before one of these geniuses rules that the Constitution is unconstitutional. And I'm actually making a serious point there. That America uniquely in the modern world has managed to hold on to the same old piece of parchment it started with for the entirety of its history, for 240 years now. The old joke about the French Constitution is the one in which an Englishman goes into a public library and asks where he can find a copy of the French Constitution. And the librarian says you'll find that filed under periodicals. That's why they have Third Empires and Fifth Republics and whatever the hell they're up to by now. They change their constitution every time. In Southern Europe, most of the constitutions date back as far as the disco era, the 1970s for Portugal, Spain, Greece. So a constitution in Portugal, Spain, and Greece is what you'd be watching on TV Land or some other retro channel here. It's back in the days of the Partridge Family and Donna Summer and Casey and the Sunshine Band. That's how antique and venerable the constitutions of Portugal, Spain, and Greece are. But America wrote down everything and stuck with it for 240 years because there was broad agreement on what the country was. And the question in the wake of something like the Ninth Circuit decision is whether there still is broad agreement on what this nation is, or whether in fact we now have a fundamental dispute about the identity of America. Now, that's not necessarily unique to the United States. You'll see various ructions in the United Kingdom over Brexit, in France over the rise of Marine Le Pen, in the Netherlands over the rise of Geert Wilders. I spend a lot of time in Europe in the last year. And one of the things that you came away with is that globalists are happy for the entire world to be dissolved into one great multicultural melange. But there are an awful lot of people in Finland who want Finland to be Finnish. In Sweden, they want Sweden to be Swedish. In France, they would like France to be French. And in Britain, they would like Britain to be British. And this isn't necessarily a particularly political thing. I experienced this as a tourist. When I was a child, I used to like traveling around Europe. You'd go 20 miles in one direction from Belgium and you'd be in another country with completely different cultural traditions, completely different cuisine. I like the way when you travel around Europe, the buildings look different. There's a boringness to multiculturalism. The staple fast food emporium in Europe is itself a kind of tribute to multiculturalism. Pizza and kebab. What could be more multicultural? East is east and west is west, and there the twain shall meet, said Kipling. And yet they do in the pizza and kebab house. A word of advice if you're traveling around Europe. If you want a pizza, go to a pizza restaurant. If you want a kebab, go to a kebab restaurant. In the typical pizza and kebab place, neither is any good. And that's a metaphor for multiculturalism too. As I said, they're arguing in Europe about the right to preserve a cultural identity, about keeping Germany German, and Austria Austrian, and the Netherlands Dutch. there's part of that in what's going on in America too, but the cold Civil War actually has a slightly different meaning here in the United States than the difference between nationalists and globalists overseas. Because America was never just an ethnic state or a cultural identity. It was also a political project. And the political project was laid down in the United States Constitution. So when you have three hack jurists, as they were in the Ninth Circuit, you're reminded that America is America, unlike those Mediterranean countries, unlike France, unlike Germany, unlike Austria, has kept the same old constitution it started with 240 years ago, which sounds like continuity and stability. And yet, in fact, what that boils down to in practice is that you get three twerp judges like these fellas at the Ninth Circuit who torture the plain meaning of the English language in order to stand the United States Constitution on its head and mean something entirely different from what the framers of that Constitution meant. And for me, what's interesting about that is that there is now no agreement. There is less and less agreement among the two principal forces, among the 65 million people who voted for Donald Trump and a big chunk of the people who did not vote for Donald Trump, not the whole 60 million of them, but getting up there, as to what this country is. And that's why it seems entirely normal for people to be arguing that citizens from terrorist states should have the right of untrammeled entry to the United States. By terrorist states, I'm thinking of people like Iran. Iran, the other day, marked the anniversary of its revolution, which toppled the Shah, one of the great consequential acts of the late 20th century and a disaster for civilization. And these guys are all jumping up and down in the street shouting death to America. And to an American liberal, when you see people dancing up and down in the street shouting, "Oh, dead to America! Dead to America!" The United States government, in order to demonstrate its virtue, cannot distinguish between someone seeking entry to this country who's shouting, "Dead to America!" and a Canadian snowbird coming to winter at his vacation condo in Florida for 6 weeks. You are not allowed to distinguish between the Toronto snowbird and the crazy old crone in the body bag in the streets of Tehran yelling, "Death to America." That's the liberal worldview in America. It's the liberal worldview all over the planet, which is why Trump's executive order has generated street protests in Canada, Britain, Europe, where liberals across the developed world are protesting in the streets for the rights of Somalis and Iranians to have unfettered access to the United States. It's puzzling to me in some ways because we're told that America, like the rest of the Western world, is one of the most evil and racist, misogynist, homophobic societies on earth, and yet everyone on the planet should have the right to come and live here in one of the most racist, sexist, and homophobic societies on earth. There are contradictions in the multicultural ideal, and at a certain level, we all understand them. This story is in the New York Times. Look at this headline. For Roma in France, education is an elusive path to integration. If you're not familiar with Roma, it's a well-known word over in Europe. It's nothing to do with Arrivederci Roma or anything like that. Roma is the new word for what used to be called gypsies. And Romophobia is now the new homophobia. You're not allowed to be in the least bit Romophobic about gypsy encampments on the edge of your town. And this story in the New York Times is a classic one. It's about the difficulties that the Roma have getting access to education. It's an elusive path. It's an elusive path says the New York Times, to integration. The Roma are not interested in integration. That's why they are transients who live in gypsy encampments. They turn up and set up their encampment in your field because they don't want to be integrated with the broader community. They don't want to have one Roma child sitting in a classroom with 19 French school children. They're not interested in Roma education. But the New York Times is asking us to pretend that it's all the fault of the racist and discriminatory French. While there is consensus that public education could help integrate a Roma population that has long faced systematic discrimination, the obstacles remain formidable. When I first started coming here, I didn't really know what school was, said Slavi, reflecting on his school, Marie Curie, in this Paris suburb. School will help me a lot, more than anything. Anyone who has ever had any dealings with the Roma know that the reason their children are not in school is nothing to do with systematic discrimination. It's because for the average Roma parents, your school-age children are an economic opportunity. You can go to any major city in Europe and what you will see is Roma children either begging or stealing and then taking the proceeds back to their parents. That's why they're not in school. Everybody knows that. Everybody who has encountered Roma in the streets of an Italian city, in the streets of an Austrian city, a Balkan city, will know that that is what is going on. That for their parents, their main value is as an economic asset that can either beg or steal and thereby bulk up the family income. But we are meant to pretend that they share some desire to integrate into the French school system. Here's something else on the internal contradictions of multiculturalism. This is an Islamic peace conference poster. So this is one of those Islamic outreach posters. This is from down in Australia, the Australian Islamic Peace Conference, because we all know that Islam means peace. And so all these big shot Muslims down in Australia are getting together and having this big Australian Islamic Peace Conference. And they've published this poster for the conference. Now, if you look at it there's a big bunch of imams. They're all your A-list imams in Australia, the big bearded guys. They're all going to be talking about Islam means peace. We're peaceful imams. We're good Australian imams. We're hot for peace. Allahu Akbar. We love the peace. And they're also, because they're trying to make themselves look like perfectly integrated members of Australian society, there's also some women participating in the conference. There's psychologist Monique Toohey. There's social worker Nina Trad Azam. And there's the Islamic teacher Jamal Uddin. These three ladies, very distinguished female speakers. So let's close in on the poster and look at them so we can see the difference between Monique Toohey and Nina Trad Azam and Jamal Uddin. Oh, look at that one. Is that Monique there on the left? Or is that Nina? Or is that Jamal Ad-Din? We cannot tell. Because these women are not just body bagged in their burqas, their faces have been erased. They're not even allowed to have faces. They're blank. The men are individuals. The three women participating in the conference are blank. They have blank ovals where their faces should be, like those egg people with Twitter feeds and 7 followers, where it's just some like little egg shape that turns up on the Tweety thing. And that's all they are. They're dehumanized. They have no individual identity, unlike the men. And of course, as usual, Australian feminists have not a word to say about it. As we discussed with Raheel Raza the other day, some Australian feminists, like Germaine Greer, are all hot. They've so embraced the internal contradictions of multiculturalism that they're hot for female genital mutilation as just another lifestyle accessory, just another alternative lifestyle, just another cultural choice. But look at that poster. The men are individuals, the women have been erased. And not an Australian feminist has a word to say about it. The internal contradictions of multiculturalism. Now, we have these federal racial classification is a fascinating thing to me because it basically, when you get the census form, you've got your Asians, your blacks, your Hispanics, you've got whites. There's all kinds of strange internal contradictions in this. For example, a blonde, blue-eyed Argentine polo player who speaks impeccable English will be classified as non-white by the US federal government, but say a dark, brown-skinned Muslim from southern Egypt who can only speak Arabic and is entirely illiterate would be classified as white under US federal government guidelines because that counts as Caucasian. So we're in the situation, for example, where California is majority non-white now. There's been a spectacular demographic transformation, the sort of thing that in Rwanda, the Hutus and the Tutsis all have to go and have a big civil war to get something that dramatic. They've had an immense demographic transformation since the 1970s, where California is now majority non-white. The easiest way that California will be majority white again is if Trump's executive order stays overturned and we get increased Muslim immigration from terrorist states, because as we've seen, all these dark, brown-skinned Egyptians from southern Sudan count as white to the federal government. So you could have a spectacular regeneration of whites in California simply by massively increasing Muslim immigration. This is the insanity of the neo-apartheid policies of the racial classifications of the United States government. And you know what? Liberals don't care. In essence, the globalist project is about destruction. It's about reducing the existing order to rubble, and they don't care what then follows. They have no real interest in what comes next. The official explanation is that we will be in a happy land of the multicultural utopia. That the nice shishi gay couple at 27 Elm Street, one is an assistant choreographer on Broadway and the other has a small antique store, and the nice shishi gay couple at 27 Elm Street will all be palsy-walsy with the big bearded imam and his 3 child brides at 29 Elm Street, and they'll all make small talk over the garden fence every weekend. That's the multicultural dream. And at heart, smart liberals know that's not what it is. And they don't care, because the globalist project is more about destruction, about dissolving the existing order, and will worry about what comes next afterwards. There's actually quite a lot of overlap between modern leftism and, say, radical Islam. They're both control freaks. They're both interested in telling people who disagree with them to shut up. They're merely at different points on the same continuum. So, for example, a leftist professor at your typical American university does it through safe spaces and microaggressions. The guys who wandered into the offices at Charlie Hebdo and just opened fire and killed everybody took it to the next level. But they're both in the shut up business. And that's what binds them for the moment as control freaks. And the internal contradictions of multiculturalism will be sorted out later. But who do you think's going to win? Do you really think lefty feminists are going to be happily coexisting, like the banal happy face bumper sticker says, with the guys who made that poster down in Australia and erased those ladies' faces? No, they're not. There was a story out of Bristol, England a few years ago. You've heard these stories. They occur all over the map in the United States, Canada, elsewhere, where you have to be taught about alternative families. A family is anything it wants to be now. So all the kids have to read books like Heather Has Two Mommies. When they protest here, the school district says, tough, get used to it. That's the way it is. Diversity is our strength, and we're going to shove it down your throat. When they tried to introduce Heather Has Two Mommies in Bristol, England, which in a school that had a high percentage of Muslim parents, the Muslim parents pushed back, and Heather Has Two Mommies vanished from the shelves in nothing flat, because the school understood that they are dealing with a rather more motivated crowd than your Christian evangelicals and Squaresville cats who think that marriage should be just between a dad and a mom. And so Heather Has Two Mommies, nothing flat. Because when it's a choice between Heather Has Two Mommies or Heather has a big bearded imam who wants to marry her off to her first cousin back in Mirpur in Pakistan, bet on the latter every time, the internal contradictions of multiculturalism. And that is the world we are living in now, where deluded globalists are mainly thinking of economic rationales and multicultural utopian fairy tales, are wandering into an alliance with forces that will consume everything they value. But they don't mind, because in the end, their priority, exactly as the Jihad boys' priority, is simply to reduce the existing order to rubble and then build the new world in the rubble. And the question for all of us, as this cold civil war hardens, as these irreconcilable visions harden, is whether, as we see at the Ninth Circuit and elsewhere, there is sufficient common ground in the United States and other Western countries even to agree on what it is we're talking about. We'll see you next time.